Any other? Yeah. So a good question. Can your next header field be empty? What would that mean? So your packet would make it, every router would say, okay, there's no option, but it would make it all the way down to the destination. At the destination, I still need to know whether to hand it to TCP or UDP or some other protocol. So it'll still play the field, at the very least, the next header is the same as the protocol field in IPv4. It can be more than that, but never less than that. Any other questions? Okay. So that was the options field. The other change it makes is in IPv6, there is no header length field. This kind of follows. Why is that? Yeah. Right. The only reason we needed it in IPv4 was because of this options thing that could be variable length. We got rid of options from the IPv6 header, so we don't need a header length anymore. And then the one thing that IPv6 adds is this notion of a flow label. We haven't fully covered the context to explain a flow label, but let me try and we'll come back to it later. So the reason we have a flow label is, remember we said earlier that often when you look at a source and destination, it's not just a stream of independent packets going back and forth between them. At some higher level or application level, there's a stream of packets that are related to what the application is trying to do. For example, you could have multiple packets coming in for one download. Or in a web browser session, you could actually have multiple flows and multiple connections and multiple packets that are all part of that user's experience or the user's session. And often in the internet, there are these things called middle boxes, like firewalls or censorship boxes or intrusion detection boxes. We're going to talk about them later in the semester. But these are boxes that, for example, think of an appliance, a middle box that's trying to censor certain traffic. What it's going to try to do is to collect a set of packets that are all related and look inside that packet to say, is this connection going someplace where I don't want my users to go? And then it's going to filter. And so the network, when you're talking about these kinds of functions, it needs to have some notion of which packets together form some application context or stream of related packets that that box wants to look at. With the IPv4 header, there's no explicit way for the network to know, this sequence of packets are all related. And so instead, what we've always relied on with IPv4 is all these ad hoc rules that say, well, for all traffic going from the same source IP to the same destination with the same port numbers, these must all be related. And it's pretty ad hoc, and sometimes it goes wrong, but that's what people do. So what IPv6 instead said, okay, if there are boxes in the network that need to know which packets are kind of related, let me have this notion of a flow label. And at the end host, I'm going to use the same flow label to denote a stream of packets that are all related. So it's just taking the guesswork out for the network. Does that make sense? So for example, you might use the same flow label for all packets that are part of the same file download. You could also use the same flow label for all packets that are part of one browsing session. So both the ads and the content and the video that are part of one browsing session. There are no rules that limit end hosts on how they use the flow label. But it's a hint to the network that the end host thinks of these packets as related. Yep. As far as I know, it's up to let me double check on that. I believe it's undefined or unlimited. There might be some that are well set aside, but let me confirm that. I don't know if you guys know. No. Let me get back to you on that. Any questions about this? Okay. So IPv4 and IPv6, where does that lead us? This is the IPv6 header. So that you can compare it, here's the IPv4 header side by side. And here's the color coding. So let's go through these one at a time. Yellows are the fields that are identical, semantic and not syntactic, but semantically from IPv4 to IPv6. It's pretty much the version number. It's now value 6, but it's the same field. And the source and destination addresses. Okay, and as you can see, they're 4 times larger. Orange are all the fields that went away from the IPv4 header. So we have fragmentation, header length, checksum, and options. Okay, these are gone. Blues are fields that have they've stayed. We've either renamed them or slightly changed how we use them. So type of service is now called traffic class. Payload length we still need because the payload of a packet can still be different, right, from one packet to another. Next header is playing the role of the protocol field and more. And time to live was renamed hop limit as being, people thought time to live was not quite capturing what the TTL was doing. It's actually a limit on the number of hops. So it's now called hop limit. So that's really the extent of the change going from V4 to V6. Any questions? Yeah. So it's nice to think about actually what is the philosophy underlying all of these changes. What would you say the designers of IPv6, what principle have they been applying in doing this cleanup? Yeah? Yeah, it's a very aggressive use of, or application of the end-to-end principle. Anything that could be pushed to the end host has been pushed to the end host. Right? So fragmentation and checksum are gone. In fact, the only thing that's left is the TTL. Why keep the TTL? Is that something? Yep. Yeah, because we needed TTL because of all these routing convergence issues and loops. It's really hard to imagine how an end host could help with that. Routing convergence truly is a network problem. There's also an emphasis on simplification, which is why they got rid of options and the IP header length. But at the same time, I think the thing that's nice about the IPv6 header is they've kept in mind this need for extensibility. And they've done it actually very cleanly with just this kind of generalized next header approach, which allows you to over time define new functions for the network, as well as this notion of a general flow label, which is, the purists of IPv4 had this idea that you have a very strict division between what the network does and the end hosts do, and the network should never look at anything more than the IPv4 header. Well, 25 years of experience has taught us that the network is looking at more than the IPv4 header. And so having a flow label is a nice way for end hosts to start communicating some of the application semantics into the network without actually embedding application logic into the network. So it's a useful way of passing hints between the end host and the network. Yeah? Yeah, so let me give you a specific example, and we'll come back to this in a much, much later lecture when we do middle boxes. But as an example, let's say that you had an intrusion detection system that's sitting in your network, that's run by your ISP. And what the intrusion detection system does is it looks at the URL that you're going to when you're browsing. And it either says, for whatever reason, parental control, I'm going to drop this traffic, or, censorship, I'm going to drop this traffic. So, but what it needs to look at is the URL. The URL is not in the IPv4 header. It's actually not even in your TCP header. It's in your application level HTTP header, which we'll talk about when we get to it. But so the network, what it has to do is collect the first few packets in your flow, reassemble them, reconstruct your HTTP headers, extract the URL, and say, this is allowed or not allowed. So what the network has to do is it has to piece together some number of packets in order to get at that URL. For that, it needs to know which packets belong to the same user browsing session. And today, the way we do that is through kind of ad hoc heuristics. We say, okay, if these packets have the same source and destination IP address, and they have the same port numbers, and they have the same protocol field, we call that a 5-tuple, then they belong to the same flow. And so I'm going to assemble packets that had that flow. It's a little ad hoc. So for example, if you had one browsing session where you're talking to 2 content providers for that web page, the network gets confused about whether they actually, it has no real easy way of knowing that they're related. So rather than have all these ad hoc rules, what IPv6 is saying is I will allow applications to put a flow label in. And so then the network just has to look at the flow label and say these packets belong to the same user session or the same flow. We'll get back to this when we talk about middle boxes. Any other? Okay, so then moving on, let's look at a quick security analysis of the IP header. So we're going to look at a fairly, as you probably realized by now, the original designers of the internet didn't worry about security. So there are all kinds of things you can do at the network layer that are security threats. What we're going to look at today is one very narrow subset of them, which is imagine that you are a sender and you're sending an IPv4 header packet out, and you get to do whatever you want with the IPv4 header. Okay. What are some of the things that you could do that would be a security problem? That could be deemed as an attack or something. So remember, you get to fill these fields here on this header as you choose. There are many fields that can be exploited. Thoughts? Yeah? So the TTL, and you've actually already done this in section, you could set the TTL to be fairly short so that that's what traceroute does. So then you get an error message back from the router and you're effectively tracing the internal topology of the ISP. Yep. Even easier than that in a way. Maybe not easier, but yep. You could spoof the destination. I was expecting the source, but you can spoof addresses, absolutely right. We can get to a bit whether you're better off spoofing the destination or the source, yeah? You could mess with the checksum so it gets rejected. Interesting, you can certainly do that. Why would you do that? You're only getting your own packets rejected. So it's doable. I would argue that it's not much of an attack if the only effect is that you're dropping your own packets. Any others? Okay, let's go through them. IP address integrity. As someone pointed out, in IPv4 you can put the addresses you want in the source and destination field. Ideally, let's start with the source, which is where more problems arise. Ideally, as a sender, you should be putting your own address as the source field. Right? But if you don't, there's nothing in the network that's actually checking that you are who you claim to be. Right? So you could be sending packets with any source that you want. What are the implications of this? Why would you actually claim to be a source that you're not? Why do you think someone might do this? There's two reasons why you might do it. Yep. Yeah, okay, 3 reasons. You might want to trick the destination. How far would you go with that, though? Because here's what's going to happen. Right, you send a packet, and I claim to be Sarah. And I send a packet to Alex. Alex's response is going to go to Sarah, not to me. Right? So marginal gains there. So the most common reason people do this is, let's say you want to attack a destination. So let's say I want to send tons and tons and tons of packets to Alex and overwhelm his machine and crash it. The minute Alex is under attack, what is he going to do? He's going to tell his ISP, hey, someone's attacking me, you need to put a filter in your network and drop that traffic. The most natural filter you would say is, hey, all these packets coming from Sylvia, she's attacking me, drop all traffic coming from Sylvia. But if I spoof my source address and I choose a different address for every packet, then it's very hard for an ISP to filter traffic because they don't know where it's coming from. Right? All they see is somewhere close to Alex, packets are coming in from millions of different IP addresses, and Alex is being taken down. So this is a very common attack on the internet. And it's hard to know how to filter it if you can spoof addresses. Make sense? There's another one you could do, which is to actually be a pain for the source address that you're spoofing. So this is a different one. So let's say now I want to really annoy Sarah. Right? So what I could do is send packets to 1 million different destinations, claiming that they all come from Sarah. So those 1 million destinations are all going to respond back to Sarah and overwhelm her link. So that's 2 ways in which you can exploit the source IP address. And there are all kinds of attacks people have done, exploiting the fact that you can set whatever source IP address you want. Implications of the type of service field. This one's actually pretty simple. You can just ask for high priority traffic. Right? So your attack traffic is now, not only are you generating attack traffic, it's actually being treated better than other traffic on the internet. If the type of service or getting high priority traffic comes with an extra charge, you have to pay more for your service, then you can combine asking for high priority traffic with spoofing the source address, and you're now passing the bill off to your victim. Right? This is why in practice, as Rob was saying, pretty much all operators